In July 2018, former British Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg found himself at the inaugural Democracy Summit in Copenhagen with Tony Blair and Joe Biden. The themes of that year's summit will be familiar to all of us: the dangers of fake news and protectionism, technology and cybersecurity on platforms like Facebook mainly. Within a few months of that summit in Denmark, sponsored by Facebook by the way, Clegg had found himself a job at Facebook, where he has since risen to become one of the most senior executives at its parent group, Meta. This year he was promoted to President of Global Affairs, a position which reportedly earns him upwards of $15 million a year and arguably gives him more power than when he was in government itself. This is the story of how he got there and what has happened at Meta since then. Part 1. Meta. If you use the internet, you probably use a Meta product. There are now 3 billion global monthly active users on Facebook, 2 billion on WhatsApp, and 1 billion on Instagram. Nick Clegg's job at Meta, as it was described to me, is to set the firm's overall strategy for dealing with the world's most powerful regulators and to manage the politics that inevitably come with the company's extraordinary global wealth and influence. But as I spoke to more insiders, it was clear to me that this wasn't the whole picture. When Clegg joined Meta, the company was in trouble with the public and with policymakers. First, there were the Cambridge Analytica revelations, in which it emerged that people's private data had been collected without their knowledge and sold to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Then, during the COVID pandemic, claims of both misinformation and censorship were launched at Meta from either side of the political spectrum. But as I found out, Meta has a much bigger problem than just data leaks and misinformation. Part 2. Crime. Meta is used not just by ordinary people to read, buy and sell ordinary things, but also, of course, by criminal gangs, sexual predators, authoritarian governments and terrorists. Today in the UK, 10% of all crime happens on a Meta platform. That's not online crime, remarked one minister I spoke to, but all crime. And it's getting worse. Not only has online fraud exploded on platforms like Facebook Marketplace, but child sexual exploitation is rife and is now being made easier by Meta's decision to roll out end-to-end encryption across its platforms, in effect making it much easier for paedophiles to groom and abuse children without anyone knowing. Children are now being groomed on Facebook, exploited on Instagram, and then abused on WhatsApp. They are responsible for an awful lot of harm that's happening in this country, a second government minister I spoke to told me. Last year alone, there were around 32 million reports of online child sexual exploitation made to something called the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. Of these, 21 million came from Meta platforms. And it's not just child abuse. According to the government, fraud now accounts for 40% of all crime in England and Wales, with as much as 80% of that happening online. Effectively, Meta has become a crime scene. And policymakers are beginning to notice, and pressure on the platform is mounting from all sides of the political spectrum. But with little help, Meta has effectively dodged the most dangerous bullets that were aimed its way. While the government has passed new rules to force British banks to repay customers ripped off online, social media platforms like Meta, where the fraud actually takes place, won't have to pay a penny, even though they make money from this stuff. But as a government insider told me, it's the Treasury which doesn't want to impose financial burdens on social media companies, which would make Britain less attractive for inward investment, particularly from tech companies. For Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, one of his central objectives is to make London and the Triangle with Oxford and Cambridge the Silicon Valley of Europe. Nick Clegg and his team, who had met regularly with the government, have effectively got their way. When it comes to a choice between tackling online fraud and other crime that's happening on these sites and the financial incentives to keep these companies in Britain, at the moment there seems to be only one winner. Part 3. Privacy. In December 2023, Meta announced that it was rolling out end-to-end encryption for all personal chats and calls on Messenger and Facebook, meaning, as it boasted at the time, the content of your messages and calls with friends and family are protected from the moment they leave your device to the moment they reach the receiver's device. As a result, Meta went on, nobody, including Meta, can see what's said or sent. By rolling out end-to-end encryption then, Meta has, in effect, willfully blinded itself to what is happening on its platforms, because it believes in the principle of privacy. Now, this is a choice Clegg and Meta has repeatedly defended in meetings with the government, but the government is furious about this, and particularly the way it's been handled. Now, there are perfectly good reasons, and the government admits this, for end-to-end encryption, and indeed the government itself and its secret services around the world rely on it. But the government also believes that the number of reports of online child sexual exploitation may soon collapse as a result of Meta's platforms going dark. Today, British authorities receive 800 reports of online child sexual exploitation every month from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, leading to something like 1,200 children being protected from predatory adults every month. Now, the government worries this is just going to disappear. In the autumn of 2022, Suella Braverman, then Home Secretary, held a video call with Clegg about this very issue. In the meeting, Clegg claimed that Meta was being unfairly targeted because it was making the majority of these referrals to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. Around the same time, the Online Harms Act was making its way through Parliament. This was a really big piece of legislation that would compel Meta to identify, mitigate, and manage the risks of harm from illegal content that is actively harmful to children on its platforms. Now, the two things here are quite difficult to add up. After Braverman and Clegg's discussion in 2022, Meta effectively stonewalled the British government, according to one government minister I spoke to. It also threatened to remove WhatsApp from the UK if it was forced to compromise its end-to-end encryption. Since then, the company has not only not pulled WhatsApp from the UK, but pushed ahead with the rollout of its end-to-end encryption across all its other services, after the UK government reassured the company it would not be forced to break its privacy settings. Now, across the world, there's been plenty of political outrage at Meta. In the United States, Mark Zuckerberg was dragged before Congress and forced to apologize to parents whose children had died following sexual exploitation or harassment on social media. Lindsey Graham told him that he had blood on his hands. Now, here in the UK, we don't seem to have had much of this political outrage, and Nick Clegg, so far, has not faced the same level of scrutiny as Mark Zuckerberg. In conclusion, the story of Nick Clegg, the British government and Meta raises serious questions about the nature of democracy in the modern world, when companies like Meta operate far beyond mere national law, abiding by their own rules set by their own presidents, seemingly too big for governments to control. In a sense, the whole story is evidence for the Harvard economist Danny Roderick's famous trilemma of globalization. This is the idea that we can't have democracy, national sovereignty, and economic globalization all at the same time, but we must sacrifice one to protect the others. The more powerful and globally integrated giant corporations like Meta become, pursuing their own corporate interests, the less democratic power we seem to have over them. Thanks for listening. I'm UnHerd's political editor, Tom McTague. Become a subscriber to read my full investigation into Nick Clegg's role at Meta, which includes more exclusive revelations about the former Deputy Prime Minister, as well as our other premium articles.